I think we've had a great start thanks to Joe. So we're just going to focus on a few topics as we sort of dive into this panel discussion. If I may, I think from a Temasek perspective, the way we see the world, and we've just published the report that Joe referred to along with the consensus. We see it as sort of the money layer in terms of tokenizing fundamentally money, tokenizing the asset layer, and then really identity as a broader enabler. So maybe with that, I'll probably start with Conan, just talking a little bit about how does he see tokenization panning out, and what are the real drivers for some of the efforts in this space.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, the global drivers, and Joe, I think, talked through a lot of them, that we have an internet that isn't necessarily built to efficiently trade in transactions. And so you see across a whole number of asset classes a search for more efficiency and more effectiveness, whether it's in settling trades, cross-border payments. These are the traditional cases that you've heard about for a long time. And we've now had an ecosystem that is built up and I think tokenized almost every asset that you could think of under the sun, and is really ready for those other layers to come in. And I think that against that driver, I think that the biggest development globally that we see this year is the trend to tokenize fiat central bank currencies. And this was really accelerated. It's been something that many of the central banks of the world have been working on for many years, but it was really accelerated with Facebook's Libra proposal, the G7 forming a study group to react to that under Benoit Cœuré, who interestingly will now go to the BIS. So I think that that's really the big global trend that we see, is that money layer coming in from the central banks and the official sector, and what will follow on from there.
No, so that's interesting. I think there continues to be a lot of attention on Libra, but it's great that you're calling out the efforts in the fiat world. Maybe moving on to Matt, what would be your one global breakout sort of trend if you were to call it out?
Well, I think the tokenization of things is upon us. Between fiat currencies to look, there's $600 trillion of assets on the planet, and my sense is they're all going to get tokenized. The ability to get liquidity, price discovery, is going to be just too good for investors in terms of taking a lot of the frictions out to achieve that. What that also means in tokenizing all these real world assets, which today a lot of us in crypto are thinking about Web3, thinking about distributed compute and storage and identity and all these other interesting layers. But traditional investors, I think, are going to gravitate to tokenize traditional assets because that's what they know. That being said, there's a whole new architecture of wallets, exchanges, and custody, and all that scaffolding is net new. What will be interesting and disruptive for global finance, Wall Street, etc., will be how they adopt it, or does that get put into a software layer where big tech, crypto startups, etc., start to compete on those layers. That'll be interesting.
Yeah. So maybe before we move on to Paul, it'll be great if you can elaborate a little bit on, I think you're speaking about the convergence of a lot of the activities which have been happening in the crypto world, but coming more into the traditional financial markets. Can you just elaborate a little bit as to how you sort of see that happening in the next sort of 2 to 3 years? And then maybe Paul, you can sort of elaborate from your side as well.
Yeah, I mean, people always talk about market structure as a thing, and in crypto, not too many people think that way. They just kind of jumped over the current market structure and are envisioning this whole new future, and it's kind of devoid of that. I think it's more nuanced, whereby I think existing business systems and new crypto systems need to interoperate. There's going to be some disruption, but I think it's going to be more so evolution. But the institutional investor bite in crypto, broadly defined, has not shown up yet in any material way. I think the gateway of tokenizing traditional assets, whether that's a bar of gold, a hotel, a cap table, barrel of oil, I think those things start to give institutional investors a training wheels and a baby step towards some of these more interesting new digital cooperatives that are tokenized. So I think it's still a lot of building to do. A lot of those layers I mentioned, exchanges, wallets, custody, are still fresh. They're still new. They're measured in weeks and months and maybe a few years, and are getting battle tested every day.
Well, I think we'll come back later to maybe what actually needs to happen by way of enablers. But maybe Paul, would love to hear your thoughts on the one sort of breakout trend or anything that you would add to what just Matt said.
Yeah, I think Matt's right about infrastructure needed for a lot of these different use cases. One of the use cases that we've seen quite a bit this year is around decentralized finance. What do we think is decentralized finance? Again, the blockchain really enables peer-to-peer transfer of any sort of asset in a more decentralized way, in a more secure way, in a more automated way, and that increases the ability for anybody to access these markets and have global liquidity. And so therefore, different protocols are emerging that allow you to basically aggregate liquidity for use cases around lending, for instance. Right now, in terms of DeFi usage, there's over $600 million locked up in protocols like Maker and like Compound. And so you're able to use the crypto that you have and be able to lend it to someone else and be able to generate returns off of it. So, that's a use case right now that is really prevalent as people have a lot of tokens and want to be able to, get yield for it. And it's quite fascinating because, there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, but that's a use case where, again, being able to do all of that using smart contracts, being able to really just have that be sort of a global use case where everybody can participate instantly is pretty phenomenal.
Just to add to that, because I think your point is
Yep.
spot on, it's also the automation. Meaning, I have these assets, and I have algorithms and decision-making things within my wallet that put my money on a treadmill and get yield or borrow it to other people, and that is all just out of the box.
Yep.
That's where the future state will get to.
And those are great deficiencies from today's world. And as we talk about, I think you mentioned training wheel tokens, but starting to think about a future world where the intermediation in data and a much more rich or atomized use of assets, data, and information flowing across the economy, then I think you start to understand a little better why this new technology and these new architectures have so much potential power.
So maybe just for the benefit of our audience, could you use a very specific example from one of your portfolio companies, or Conan, maybe from the activities you're seeing where there's actually real world uses? Because I think a lot of the concerns that typically come up is, yes, it's great to have a peer-to-peer transaction, but it sort of sits within the crypto world, and that actually doesn't have utility sort of outside. But I think a lot of companies are pushing the edges and are sort of cutting into sort of real world use cases. So, is there anything from your portfolio that you can sort of cite and talk about where you're beginning to see activity which has sort of utility?
I think you nailed a great narrative and perspective in this space, like the crypto world versus the rest of the world, right? And it's sometimes it's hard. And we're all in the crypto world. We're pretty self-aware that we're in generally a bubble, and the adoption and the speculative dynamics are what they are. But in a way, the speculative dynamics we view as capital formation, and we know we have a lot of building to do in order to for some of these systems and the UI and the APIs and all the infrastructure to speak with existing business systems. And a lot of those bridges are being built. When you make as a bank, as a financial institution, and you make a bet on a particular asset going on a particular chain, you also have to think it through kind of the future proofing of that and how is it going to interoperate on either multiple blockchains. And so you have to architect things in a way where you have to look through that lens. And I think that's really important and almost obvious. And on the second side, it's almost very difficult today because a lot of the blockchains are measured in years of being battle tested.
Yeah.
And so I think as blockchains continue to mature and you see some of these use cases, people will start photocopying that use case into a different industry, and you'll start seeing compounding.
Yeah. So I think we've already sort of started touching upon the next sort of area we wanted to go, which is where do you sort of see the highest impact? So in many ways, I think you've articulated some of the impact that you see. Maybe Conan, I'll ask you to articulate where do you sort of see the highest impact opportunities? Where are the white spaces where we may not have seen that much activity just yet, but you actually expect a lot coming our way in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, I sort of two areas. I had mentioned that central bank fiat currencies coming onto chain, I think will be a huge development and movement, just because that brings in, sort of confers a formal entrance of a lot of traditional actors into the space. So I think that initiatives like Utility Settlement Coin, that has been 14 or 15 banks of the world have been working on trying to create tokens for 5 of the major currencies of the world, will help drive a great deal of impact. I think that you saw with the People's Bank of China announcement, they went from President Xi announcing on Wednesday that the country should embrace blockchain technology. By Saturday, they rolled out their new cryptocurrency law that will be in place on January 1st. And by Monday, the deputy governor of PBOC was presiding over cooperation agreements with different folks who would come into the ecosystem there. So I think that as you see this money layer, including official sovereign central bank money, that just brings a whole universe into the world that has really been worked on and built in the last 10 years since Bitcoin launched. And I think marrying those capabilities will be really impactful. As we look at future spaces, I think, okay, tokenizing existing assets, maybe that's a very powerful place to start. But I think those places where you have complex problems and information that don't really have great models or solutions today might be particularly impactful. So I think about, I know there's been some conversation this week here about sustainable investing in a sustainable environment. And this to me strikes me as a perfect place where you don't necessarily have good standards or classification in place today for what a sustainable asset is. The world is working on defining those. I know at the IF it's one of our largest working groups of 100 financial institutions around the world trying to define standards for sustainable investments. But if you imagine that you could create a token that would automate a lot of that monitoring, reporting, and also create the capabilities where you could use more direct crowdfunding or direct peer-to-peer investment across borders particularly, that to me gives you a sense of what is this future world that we're building new capabilities for. So I think that that's a place where because the systems and infrastructure don't exist today, you don't have to meet a rip and replace evaluation, and it's that mashup of much richer data, 5G sensors and systems reporting back that yes, that investment actually was green or blue and was delivering on what you as an investor thought. So those are some of the examples, a little over the horizon, but maybe folks with portfolio today are a little closer in on the time frame.
Yeah, and I agree that the stablecoin phenomenon, coupled with what Libra has done to make every regulator around the world sit up straighter in their chair and pay attention to this, is we're going to start seeing more and more adoption and work towards that. Everything from what the MAS is doing with Project Ubin to China Coin, JP Morgan Coin, Libra. It is now going to unpack itself in a pretty profound way. And so we've got that phenomenon going on. We've got the tokenization of traditional assets. The thing I spend most of my time, and the thing that I think is the biggest value creator, the biggest impact in this space, is to create new digital cooperatives. And what that means is, a cooperative, you pool together resources and you all benefit from that. And if you could tether a token to the participants in a particular cooperative, in a particular ecosystem, then you've nailed it. This new business model that's forming, where the token is the payment, is the equity, is kind of the native currency within that cooperative. And so, you think about some of the Web3 dynamics, whether it's distributed compute, distributed storage, database, etc. And then you got this formation of a decentralized Amazon Web Services. There's a lot of provisioning involved in terms of seeing that future. But starting from the kind of initial primitives and native structures there, those are the things that I think are the biggest opportunities in this space to develop those. And I think there's going to be a lot of crypto startups, a lot of great entrepreneurs building these new layers of the internet. And then I look back at where the incumbents are today, because network effects matter in this space, right? You've got, there's no shock to anybody why Facebook is thinking about a payment layer, right? They have a massive network the brand is, gotten beaten up a little bit over the recent past. And then they don't have much of a regulatory edge, but then you look at banks, massive networks, massive regulatory edge, and have the ability to do this. So it's going to be interesting to see which networks actually exercise themselves or what new networks start to develop.
Yeah. So maybe just in the interest of time, because I'm seeing some interesting questions come through, and I want to make sure we cover some of those. So as you sort of outline this world of the Web 3.0, sort of a truly sort of a decentralized world, and I'm also hearing a theme around convergence. So it's no longer actually about the crypto world being sort of a unique, separate world. You actually have a lot of the innovation that was being done on the edges, so to speak, now being replicated pretty much in what would otherwise be the traditional world. And now, as we think about enablers, right, in terms of what will remove the blockers for the broader space to really mature as a technology and for use cases to sort of scale. Or maybe, Paul, any thoughts from you on what would you sort of see as the key enablers that we need to focus on?
Yeah, one use case that's gotten quite a bit of traction, like I mentioned, is around decentralized lending, and people are building products that actually provide a great user experience to access not only one lending protocol, but many lending protocols that have interoperability across the lending protocols. But still, to access, one of our companies, Instadap, that has, over $30 million locked up within their system, it still takes 7 steps to get in. And the biggest barrier right now is getting from fiat into a cryptocurrency, a stable coin. It could be USD backed, or it could be, backed by a basket of cryptocurrencies. And, that step takes, 2 or 3 different, layers right now. And so, a company that we invest into, Wired, is planning to be sort of the Stripe for fiat to cryptocurrency conversion, where with a credit card or with a bank account, ACH, you can actually convert your US dollars into any sort of cryptocurrency, but actually starting off with DAI, which is going to be what we think is going to be extremely useful for any sort of decentralized application. Used for collateral, used for payments, things like that. And so, we think that's going to be a huge enabler going forward, is really just kind of removing that one friction already on top of just other sorts of friction around identity, around, KYC, AML, etc.
So I think you've touched upon an interesting topic where people are developing technology to be able to actually not just scale the solutions, but help it interact with fiat, just maybe using that as a sort of exemplar. What is the core of the technology? Is it that they've figured out a better way of doing AML in terms of being able to interact sort of with the fiat world? Can you just talk a little bit more about what is the core of those technologies so that the audience can understand, what is sort of happening from by way of innovation? Because people continue to look at this as just 2 distinct worlds as opposed to being able to interact. And regulators are also watching it closely. We've seen the first set of regulated banks coming out of Switzerland, for example. At least when we speak to them, they do talk about having proprietary AML technologies, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so for instance, Wire, number one, to actually convert fiat to crypto, you need to have the licenses. And so they have the state money transmission licenses to operate in every single jurisdiction that they want to operate in. And second of all, like you mentioned, it's really identifying these users and being able to use technology to figure out what's going on with all these different transactions. Is this person high risk? Is this person not high risk, based off of all the different background checks that you can use. So basically, they're using other vendors on top of their own proprietary technology to basically assess risk as users sort of enter into this system.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just pause. If you could have some of the questions sort of flash on the screen. At this stage, I'll take one of the questions here. It's actually, I think, the second one that's coming up here. What is the future of nation states and traditional governance models in a tokenized world with decentralized peer-to-peer value networks? The reason I want to sort of call it out now is I think we've already started touching on this topic a little bit. Maybe, just to add to what Paul said, Matt, I know you're smiling year to year. Would love to get sort of a quick perspective from you on this.
Yeah, it's a great question.
We won't let you leave the country, by the way.
It's one of
the answer is incorrect.
It's one of these things that where Joe was talking about self-sovereign identity, and then my assets are kind of in this non-censorable kind of pot of Bitcoin, and you have all these components where it's like, well, I'm not really tied to a country anymore. And I think the future state, like what happens in the fast forward the future, this movie that we're part of, does it start to become, countries are going to compete for me as a citizen. Like we have this healthcare, we have this tax, we have this. It's gonna invert almost to say like, well, this is my citizen scorecard. This is what I do. This is my family. This is etc. Now, who wants to compete for me? Is Switzerland or Singapore or Sweden or that might be the fast forward future state.
Okay, so what you're basically saying is you will truly have a self-sovereign identity, and then you will choose which country you're going to be sort of associated
pressure
with.
tested
I'd love to
your-
sort of get this to the US government or wherever you're from. Conan, maybe would love to hear your perspective as to how do you sort of see the state. And I guess to be more pointed on this question would be, there's always a reference to monetary policy as a way of actually constraining the growth of tokenization. You know, from your sort of work that you're doing, you know, how do you sort of see this sort of evolving? Already the Libra announcement has resulted in a lot of countries sort of rethinking their approach.
Well, I guess I'd step back a little bit and say that the humans still very much inhabit the physical world, and nation states have figured out over the last couple of centuries how to, really dominate and regulate that world and the governance structure of that world. I think that we see a lot of stress on those systems, and I think that these new technologies have opened up a whole host of new possibilities, and I think that nation states are waking up to them. And so the recent BIS study said that 70% of central banks were investigating cryptocurrencies and understanding them either for their own use or understanding how they would impact their operations and what that would mean for monetary and fiscal policy in the future. So I think that these technologies are helping to inform the nation state as it thinks through what its future is and what its next model is. And as long as we humans are still mostly inhabiting the physical space on Earth, I think that there is a role for nation states. But you also brought up the competitiveness factor. And I think that when you see where there has been investment in understanding these opportunities and providing some regulatory or supervisory clarity, I think you see great advantages. So Singapore, clearly a market that saw this early and has invested a ton of attention. Switzerland. So those leading markets that are thinking through what do these new technologies of AI, machine learning, Internet 3.0, and a global economy much more focused maybe on the flow of data and data intermediation rather than traditional intermediation, physical intermediation. Didn't even get into it here, but future manufacturing, 3D printing, what does that do to global trade and trade finance? Is it more the trade of that IP? And in all of these scenarios, I think that the tokenization efforts that have started and are still, in the long term, probably early phase in this industry really point to what a future world looks like. So I think nation states and their organizations such as central banks are still very much working on this, but they've come way up the learning curve, I think, in the last year, and the Libra proposal was one piece of really bringing an imperative to this conversation. So.
I mean, I could definitely attest to that, in that there's massive benefits of just transparency and giving ownership in many ways of data back to the citizens. So this is less about sort of what's the role of the state, but more sort of enabling new business models is, I guess, what I'm getting, right? Maybe just, we're getting this particular question upvoted, but I don't want to spend time all three of you answering this, so maybe I'll let sort of Matt or Paul sort of choose this. So if you flash it, crypto and digital money is considered currency, and in today's world it is not regulated like the USD and FX rules. What is the panel view on this? But maybe to put it differently, I guess what I'm understanding the question being, if you truly have digital currencies, then do these become not relevant, or do these eventually get regulated like currencies? What is your view on sort of the cryptocurrencies or tokens that are coming out?
The cryptocurrencies, crypto assets, there is, for regulators, and you have to sympathize with them, there is no playbook. They're trying to catch up. The innovation is going way faster than they could kind of keep up. So where regulation is going to go is, I think there's going to be, and we're seeing this play out in real time, and we're sitting in one of the most profoundly forward-leaning countries in this space. Being in Singapore as a kind of a crypto investor, builder, advocate, it's like the air smells fresher here. It's like you guys get it, and
you should come in September.
Yeah. But it's being watched very carefully by U.S. regulators, by other regulators, and I think that regulatory arbitrage is going to be a good thing, you know, and it goes back to that capital formation, jobs, IP, etc. And you look at, you know, just the U.S. You know, I live in the U.S. and you have, you know, Silicon Valley and Wall Street. And you have all these natural, you know, kind of advantages for something like crypto, and it's not getting leveraged in the best way possible. But I think, you know, the competition, the jurisdictional competition, and then the competition just globally of money is gonna really kind of change a lot. And I think that'll accelerate stuff in certain ways where the US is not at the forefront of this, does not have a blockchain agenda like China and other countries, etc. But I think we're probably gonna get it wrong for a while, and then we're gonna be good catcher-uppers, you know, give tax-free this, free energy for miners, all these different things that you have to do to catch up. So yeah, I think it's going to be a rocky road on regulation.
So maybe just mindful of time, I'm actually going to call out a question which has only one vote right now, and I just want to make sure we don't just focus on crypto in sort of the lag end of this discussion is, so tokenization seems to center on payments and currency. What about other areas? So maybe, Paul, you could start with just talking about, when we talk about Web 3.0 applications, where do you really see the applications of some of the decentralized technologies, and which ones would you call out sort of your winners? I'll just give you sort of a minute, maybe no more than that, to talk about the winners from your perspective.
Do you want me to answer that question? What the winners?
Yeah, I'm just winners. Which are the other areas, right? I'm hoping it's outside of payments and currency. We've spent enough time on that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think especially, you know, I was talking about it with some of the entrepreneurs in Singapore. I think, you know, tokenization of real physical assets is going to be pretty fascinating. And, you know, I think right now in real estate, you know, you can invest into REITs. So maybe, you know, that's not going to be as game changing as being able to invest into maybe, you know, artwork or other sorts of collectibles. And, you know, I think there's an opportunity there to get some early traction from millennials that really sort of can make a use case like that really viral, because hey,
so more sort of alternative assets, real
exactly,
estate,
alternative assets, exactly,
okay,
that are non-real estate. I think that's pretty interesting.
Conan, from your perspective?
I think
Other areas, no money please. No
intellectual
financial
property
assets.
is a fascinating area. So you imagine if David Bowie was creating a Bowie bond today, I think it would actually be a token moving into the future. So those places where you have, again, complicated data that you want to permission and write, you know, allow for permissioning and granting of different rights in lots of different directions in a very automated system, consistently across borders and across different industries. I think that's where the opportunity is.
And I think Joe referred to this, just having that smart contracting layer,
Yep.
where you could truly automate not just sort of a contract but link it to maybe payments. Coming back to that is really, I think, where you're going with that.
Exactly.
Okay. Matt, what would you sort of call out? Any other areas that you think would be winners? Maybe using an example from your portfolio companies.
Well, one thing that we're building is this protocol called Vesper, and what Vesper does is, if you think about the future of, you know, this panel, we're talking about the tokenization of everything, which means that everything out there is a vending machine that needs a token to get a service. But the provisioning of that is very cumbersome, and certain things are really important based on time, cost, or security. So the provisioning engines to kind of get to those services or to those digital cooperatives and assemble that is going to be very important. So that provisioning, that resource management of this tokenized feature is going to be a big deal.
Well, fantastic. So once again, really like to sort of thank Conan, Matt, Paul for coming down to Singapore and spending time and sharing your insights. You know, we really hope that is useful to the audience. I think just to re-emphasize, this goes way beyond just looking at sort of the crypto world, and I think we're really beginning to see the tokenization of everything in terms of real asset classes. So thank you very much for your patience, and please feel free to catch us downstage afterwards. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.